The room was on the 22nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A long table with 12 chairs. The kind of room that is designed to communicate that serious things happen here. I had been in rooms like this before. I knew how to carry myself in them. I set my things down at the head of the table and waited. Colleagues from the investment firm filtered in. Handshakes. Introductions. The quiet professional choreography of people taking their seats before something begins. Then the door opened one last time, and Richard walked in. He saw me before I acknowledged him. I know that because I caught the half-second, the almost imperceptible pause in his step as his brain caught up with what his eyes were telling him. I nodded once, the same nod I had given everyone else in that room. Then I opened my folder and called the meeting to order. 2 years earlier, this man had stood in front of our entire office and handed me a box. Today he sat down and waited for me to begin. To understand how I got to that table, you need to know what happened the morning he put me in front of everyone and ended my career without warning. I'm not someone who needs to be the most important person in a room. I never have been. I don't arrive at meetings early to claim the best seat. I don't steer conversations back to myself when they drift. I don't perform competence. I just try to be competent and let the work carry whatever needs to be said about me. That approach had served me well for most of my career. I had been at the company for 6 years when this story begins. 6 years is long enough to understand a place completely, not just the org chart and the official version of how decisions get made, but the real version. Who actually drives things? Where the power sits? Which relationships matter and which ones are decorative? I understood that company completely. My role was in operations, the unglamorous side of any business, the side that keeps things running cleanly and efficiently, while the visible people take the meetings and attend the conferences and have their names attached to the outcomes. I was good at it, not in a way that generated applause, in a way that generated results. The company ran better because of work I did. I could demonstrate that with numbers if anyone ever asked. Mostly nobody asked, which is the nature of operations work. When it's done well, it's invisible. People only notice it when something goes wrong. For 6 years, under my watch, very little went wrong. I had built a team I was proud of. Small, focused, the kind of group where everyone understood their role and executed it without drama. I had relationships across the business, with the finance side, with the client teams, with the people who actually delivered the work day to day. I knew where every process lived and why it had been built the way it had been built and what it would take to improve it. That knowledge had taken 6 years to accumulate. It was not written down anywhere. It lived in me. The CEO's name was Richard. Richard was, I'll be fair about this, an effective leader in many of the ways that matter externally. He was sharp in front of clients, confident in investor conversations. He could read a room quickly and adjust his message to match what the room wanted to hear. He had built the company to a reasonable size and kept it there through a combination of relationships and instinct. What he was less good at was the internal stuff, the people side, the texture of what was actually happening below the level he operated at. He made decisions based on what looked right as much as what was right. He valued visibility. He rewarded the people who made noise in the right settings, the ones who presented well, who had a talent for making their contributions feel larger than they were in rooms where it mattered. I was not one of those people. I delivered. I didn't perform delivering. There's a difference, and in Richard's company that difference had a cost. I had known for a while that I was not his favorite. That's the wrong way to put it. He didn't dislike me. He just didn't think about me much. I was part of the machinery. Reliable, consistent, present. The kind of employee you stop consciously appreciating because their absence of problems stops registering as an achievement. I had thought about that dynamic more than once. Had wondered whether I should be more visible, whether I should find ways to make my work louder, whether the approach that had always felt right to me was actually serving me the way I thought it was. I decided each time to keep doing things the way I had always done them. I was not willing to become a different kind of professional to suit a particular CEO's preferences. If the work wasn't enough, then the work wasn't enough, and I would deal with that when it became relevant. It became relevant on a Tuesday morning in March. I arrived at the office at my usual time, made coffee, sat at my desk, checked my messages. Normal Tuesday. The kind of morning that gives you no indication that it is about to become the most significant day of the last several years of your life. At 9:15, an all-hands meeting was called. Unscheduled. Company-wide. Immediate attendance requested. I noticed a few colleagues exchange looks on the way to the meeting room. The kind of looks that mean people are calculating, trying to read the energy of something unexpected before it announces itself. I went in and found a seat toward the back. Richard was already at the front of the room, composed, buttoned, the way he always looked when he had prepared for something. He thanked everyone for coming on short notice, said he had some organizational updates to share, said the company was evolving and that evolution sometimes required difficult decisions. I listened to the preamble and felt something shift slightly in my chest. Not panic, just alertness. The kind your body produces when it knows something before your mind has caught up. Then Richard said my name. He said my position was being eliminated effective immediately. He said it was a structural decision. He said it was not a reflection of performance. That phrase, not a reflection of performance, which is the corporate way of saying nothing while appearing to say something kind. He said it in front of every person in that company. Junior staff who had joined 6 months ago. Colleagues I had worked alongside for years. People I had mentored. People I had covered for. People whose problems I had quietly solved at 7 in the morning before the rest of the office arrived. Every one of them was in that room. I sat very still. I did not look around at the faces turning toward me. I did not react visibly. I kept my eyes on Richard for a moment, just a moment, and then I looked down at my hands and waited for him to finish. He finished. Asked if there were questions about the broader organizational changes. There were a few. He answered them. The meeting ended. Someone from HR appeared at my elbow almost immediately. Box in hand. Apologetic face. The practiced efficiency of someone who has done this before. I stood up. I thanked her. I took the box. I went to my desk. I packed what was mine, which wasn't much because I have never been someone who decorates a workspace heavily. A few personal items. A notebook. A small plant that had lived on the corner of my desk for 3 years. Several colleagues came by while I packed. Some said nothing, just stood nearby for a moment, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Some said they were sorry. 1 or 2 looked like they wanted to say more, but didn't know how. I thanked each of them. I meant it. I did not go and find Richard. I had nothing to say to him in that moment that would have served me. Anything I said would have been emotional, and emotional is exactly what he would have expected, exactly what the public nature of that dismissal had been designed to produce. A reaction, a scene, something that would define how people remember my exit. I was not going to give him that. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button. The doors opened. I stepped in. The doors closed behind me. And that was the last time I walked out of that building as an employee. What I did next was something nobody in that room would have predicted. The first week after was the strangest. Not painful exactly, just disorienting. The way it feels when a structure you have operated inside for years is suddenly gone and your body hasn't caught up with the fact that the walls aren't there anymore. I woke up at my usual time, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and had nowhere to be. I gave myself that week. Fully. No applications, no calls, no performative productivity. Just space to let the dust settle and see what was underneath it. I thought about Richard, about the meeting, about the specific choice to do it publicly, because that was a choice. Nobody accidentally fires someone in front of the whole company. That is a deliberate decision. You do it publicly when you want to send a message, when you want to make an example, when the point is not just to remove someone, but to be seen removing them. I had been the message. I sat with that for a few days, turned it over, looked at it from different angles, and then I put it down, not because it didn't matter, but because I understood clearly that if I spent my energy on Richard, on what he had done and why and what it said about him, I would be spending it in exactly the wrong direction. He had already taken 6 years of my work in one very public morning. I was not going to give him whatever came next as well. Whatever came next was mine. In the second week, I started doing something more useful. I took stock. I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, and I wrote down everything I actually had. Not what I had lost, what I had. 6 years of deep operational knowledge in a specific industry. Relationships with clients, suppliers, contractors. Real relationships built over time, the kind that belong to the person, not the company. A track record of results that existed whether or not anyone was currently paying me for it. A skill set that was specific and demonstrable and genuinely valuable. I looked at that list for a long time, and I thought, why am I looking for someone to hire me for this? The thought arrived quietly, without drama, almost matter-of-factly, like something that had been waiting patiently in the back of my mind for the right moment to step forward. I had spent 6 years making someone else's company run better. I knew how to do it. I knew the industry. I knew the clients. I knew where the inefficiencies lived in businesses like the one I had just left, and I knew exactly how to fix them. I could do that for myself. I had savings, not a vast amount, but enough to give me a runway if I was careful. I had no investors, no partners, no safety net beyond what I had built myself over the years, which, when I thought about it, was exactly how I had always operated anyway. I decided to build something. I registered the company on a Wednesday afternoon, alone at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a laptop. No ceremony, no announcement, just the administrative beginning of something that didn't exist yet. Then I called 3 people, not to ask for anything, just to have honest conversations. A former client I had a strong relationship with, a contractor I had worked with closely for years, and a colleague from early in my career who had built his own business and whose judgment I trusted completely. I told each of them what I was doing. I asked each of them what they thought. The former client said he had always thought my work was the best thing about the company he'd dealt with. He said he'd be open to a conversation. The contractor said he'd work with me directly if I needed him. My old colleague said it's about time. I went back to my desk and kept building. Those first months were slow in the way that beginnings always are. I was doing everything myself. The work, the administration, the business development, the conversations that might become clients, and the conversations that didn't. There were weeks where the progress felt invisible, where I would look at what I had built so far and struggle to see how it became what I needed it to become. I had moments of doubt. I want to be honest about that. There were evenings where the quiet of working alone felt less like focus and more like isolation, where the question of whether I had made a sensible decision sat heavily at the end of a long day. I didn't let those moments make decisions for me. I had a discipline about it, something I had developed over years of operational work, where the job was to stay steady when things were uncertain. Doubt is information. It tells you to check your assumptions, to reassess, to make sure you're still moving in the right direction. It is not an instruction to stop. I checked my assumptions. I reassessed. I kept moving. 6 months and I signed my first real client. Not a small one, a proper engagement with a company of real size that had real problems I knew how to solve. The kind of contract that tells you the thing you're building is not just an idea anymore. I delivered well. I documented everything. I asked for a testimonial when it was done. Then I went and found the next one. The work was good. I knew it was good because the results were measurable and the clients could see them. That clarity, the direct line between what I did and what it produced, was something I hadn't fully had in 6 years of working inside someone else's structure. It was clarifying in a way I hadn't anticipated. Word started moving through the industry. Not loudly, just steadily. The way it does when the work is consistent and the people you work with tell other people. I kept my head down. I kept building. And I didn't think about Richard. Not much. Not deliberately. He existed somewhere in the back of my awareness the way a scar exists. You know it's there, but doesn't hurt anymore, and most days you don't think about it at all. The company he had dismissed me from was doing fine without me. I heard things occasionally through industry contacts. Nothing dramatic. Just the normal life of a business continuing to operate. I was glad about that in a distant way. Not for Richard's sake. For the people still there, the colleagues I had respected, the junior staff who deserved stability. I was building something real, and something was beginning to take notice. I didn't know it yet, but the calls that were about to start arriving were going to change everything. The call that changed everything came on a Thursday afternoon. A man named Thomas, senior partner at an investment firm I had heard of but never dealt with directly. He was precise on the phone, the kind of precise that tells you someone values their time and expects you to value it too. He said his firm had been watching my company's progress, that they had taken note of the client results, that they were interested in a conversation. I said I was open to one. We met the following week at their offices. Clean, understated space. The kind that communicates confidence without effort. Thomas was accompanied by a colleague named Sarah, analytical, sharp, the kind of person who asked the question underneath the question you thought you were answering. They asked me about the business, about how I had built it, about the methodology behind the results, about where I saw it going over the next 3 years. I answered everything directly. No inflation, no performance. Just the honest picture of what I had built and what I believed it could become. They listened carefully. At the end of the meeting, Thomas said they would be in touch. I thanked them and left. I drove home thinking it had gone well without knowing what well meant in that context. Investment conversations are their own language. Positive signals don't always become anything. I had learned not to weight a good meeting too heavily until something concrete followed it. Something concrete followed it. Thomas called 3 weeks later, said the firm wanted to move to the next stage. Due diligence, deeper conversations, a formal assessment of the business. He said if everything aligned, they had a structure in mind that they believed would interest me. The due diligence took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of requests. Documents, contracts, client records, financial statements, methodology breakdowns. Everything I had built examined from every angle by people whose job was to find the gaps. It didn't find many, because I had built it properly. From the beginning, every process documented, every result recorded, every client relationship maintained with the kind of consistency that shows up clearly when someone looks closely. I had learned that from 6 years of operational work. You build things so that they can be examined. You keep your record straight. You make sure the reality matches the presentation, because eventually someone always looks. The gaps they did find were small and fixable. I fixed them quickly and without defensiveness. That seemed to matter to Thomas and Sarah as much as the results themselves. They said as much in one of our later conversations, that how someone responds to scrutiny tells you more than the scrutiny itself finds. We moved to the offer stage in month 3. The structure Thomas had mentioned turned out to be an acquisition. My company absorbed into the firm's portfolio, my methodology applied across multiple portfolio companies, and a senior leadership role sitting above that entire operation. Not a job, a position with real authority, real scope, and terms that reflected both. The number was serious. I took the document home, read it twice, slept on it, read it again in the morning. Then I called a lawyer, the same discipline I always apply when something important is on paper. 2 days of careful review. A few negotiated adjustments that Thomas accepted without friction. I signed on a Friday morning. We shook hands. Thomas said he was looking forward to what we would build together. I said the same and meant it. I spent that weekend in a quiet kind of stillness. Not celebration exactly. Something more internal than that. The specific feeling of a chapter closing cleanly, where you can look back at the full arc of something and see how each part led to the next. The dismissal, the kitchen table, the notebook, the first client, the slow build, the due diligence, the signature. 2 years, start to finish. I thought about the morning Richard had handed me a box in front of everyone. I thought about the elevator doors closing. I thought about sitting at my kitchen table that first week with nowhere to be. I didn't feel angry about any of it. I hadn't for a long time. What I felt was something closer to gratitude, not for what Richard had done, but for what the experience had forced me to build. The dismissal had removed every option except the right one. It had pushed me into a room with only one door, and the door had led here. The onboarding process with the firm began the following week. Meetings, introductions, briefings on the portfolio companies. There were several businesses of varying sizes across the industry, each at a different stage, each with different challenges. My role was to work across all of them, to apply what I knew, to raise the operational standard of the whole portfolio. I was given an overview document of the portfolio companies. I read through it on a Tuesday evening. I was almost at the end when I stopped. One of the company names. I read it again. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. I recognized the name. Of course I recognized it. I had spent 6 years inside it. Richard's company was in the portfolio. I sat with that for a while, turned it over slowly. I hadn't known. Thomas had never mentioned it specifically, and I had never asked for the full portfolio list during negotiations. It simply hadn't come up, and now here it was, on a page, in a document sitting on my kitchen table. I closed the document. I made a cup of tea. I stood at my kitchen window and looked out at the street for a while. I thought about what this meant practically, about the meeting structure, about who would be in which rooms, about the moment, which was now inevitable, when Richard and I would be in the same room again for the first time since he had handed me that box. I thought about how I wanted to handle it. The answer came quickly, and it was simpler than I might have expected. Exactly the same way I handle everything else. The first board meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday, 3 weeks away from the moment I had found Richard's company name in that document. 3 weeks to prepare. Not emotionally, I didn't need 3 weeks for that, but practically, professionally, the way you prepare for any meeting that matters. I spent those 3 weeks learning everything I could about the portfolio, every company, every set of numbers, every operational challenge that had been flagged in the briefing materials. I read every document Thomas's team sent me. I asked for the ones they hadn't sent. I had calls with the firm's analysts. I built a clear picture of where each business was, what it needed, and what a realistic improvement trajectory looked like. Richard's company was one of several. I treated it exactly like the others. That wasn't a performance of neutrality. It was genuine. By then, I had spent 2 years building something from nothing. 2 years of early mornings and difficult problems, and the particular focus that comes from working entirely for yourself. Richard and what he had done existed somewhere behind all of that. Not gone, just small. The way things become small when you fill the space around them with something real. I was not walking into that boardroom to settle anything. I was walking in to do a job. Thomas briefed me the week before, walked me through the meeting structure, the attendees, the format. He mentioned Richard's company and Richard's name in the same, even tone he used for everything else. He had no reason to know the history, and I had no reason to tell him. I nodded, took my notes, asked the relevant questions. Thomas said, "You'll be running the room. These are your meetings now." I said I understood. I prepare my materials over the following days. Clean, structured, focused on the work. What I had observed across the portfolio so far. Where the operational gaps were. What I wanted each company to bring to the table. The tone I wanted to set from the first meeting. Direct, practical, high standard, no politics. The night before I laid my things out. Folder, documents, notebook. The ordinary preparation of someone who takes their work seriously. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. Slept well. In the morning, I dressed carefully. Not differently than usual, just carefully. The way you do when you want to feel like yourself in a room that could carry other feelings if you let it. I drove to the firm's offices. Took the elevator to the 22nd floor. The meeting room was already open. Long table, 12 chairs, the city visible through the windows behind the head of the table. I set my things down at the head. Colleagues from the firm arrived first. Introductions, handshakes, the efficient warmth of professionals who respect each other's time. I knew some of them from the onboarding process. Others I was meeting for the first time. The portfolio company representatives filtered in after that. I greeted each one, learned names, noted faces, made the small mental records you make at the beginning of a working relationship. The room filled steadily. I checked my watch. 1 minute to the hour. One chair still empty. The door opened, and Richard walked in. He was the same. That was the first thing I registered. He looked essentially the same as the last time I'd seen him. Composed, well-dressed. The practiced ease of someone who has spent decades being comfortable in professional settings. And then he saw me. I watched it happen in real time. The recognition, the recalibration, that half second where his face did several things at once before he brought it back to neutral. I nodded once. The same nod I had given every other person in that room. Then I looked back down at my folder. I did not pause. I did not mark the moment with anything. Not a smile, not a longer look, not the smallest signal that this was anything other than an ordinary Wednesday morning meeting with an ordinary set of attendees. Because that was exactly what it was. I looked up at the room. 12 people. Folders open. Ready. I said, "Good morning. Let's get started." And I ran the meeting. Not for him. Not against him. Just cleanly and well, the way I run everything. I moved through the agenda with precision. Asked direct questions. Listened to the answers properly. Challenged where challenging was warranted. Acknowledged what was working. Set clear expectations for what needed to improve. Richard participated. He answered when addressed. He contributed where he had something to contribute. He sat in that room for 90 minutes and engaged with the meeting like a professional, which was all I required of him, all I required of anyone. When it was over, I thanked the room, said I was looking forward to the work ahead. People gathered their things. Conversations broke into smaller ones around the table. I was speaking with one of the firm's analysts when I became aware of Richard waiting at a slight distance. Patient, composed on the surface, waiting for me. I finished my conversation, turned to him, and waited to hear what he had to say. Richard waited until the room had mostly cleared. He was good at that, reading the social geometry of a situation, knowing when to move and when to hold. He had always had that instinct. He stepped closer, kept his voice low, professional on the surface, but with something underneath it, a careful, measured quality that told me he had been thinking about what he wanted to say for the last 90 minutes while sitting in that room. He said my name, said it was good to see me. I said the same. Then he said, "I imagine this is a somewhat unusual situation." I looked at him for a moment. I said, "I think it was a good meeting. The portfolio companies have real potential." He paused. That wasn't the response he had prepared for. He had come over with something specific to say, some version of an acknowledgement or an explanation, or perhaps something that walked the line between the two without fully committing to either. I could see him recalibrating. He said, "I wanted to say that what happened, the way things ended at the company." He paused again. Said, "I've thought about it." I nodded once. Then I said, "I appreciate that. I'll look forward to working together going forward." I held out my hand. He shook it, and that was it. I picked up my folder, said I had another call to get to, walked out of the room. In the elevator on the way down, I stood quietly and looked at the numbers changing above the doors. I felt nothing unresolved. That was the clearest way to describe it. The conversation had happened, and it had contained exactly what it needed to contain and nothing more. He had wanted to address the past. I had redirected to the future, not as a power move, genuinely, because the past was finished and the future was what I was actually interested in. The work began in earnest after that. I was across the full portfolio now, regular meetings, operational assessments, direct conversations with leadership teams about what was working and what wasn't. It was the most expansive version of work I had ever done. Not just solving problems inside one organization, but looking across several simultaneously and finding the patterns, the common gaps, the shared opportunities. I was good at it. Better, I think, than I had been at anything before because I was doing it with full ownership. No structure above me diluting the decisions. No politics filtering what I could see or say. Just the work, clearly visible, and my judgment applied directly to it. Richard's company was one of the harder ones in the portfolio. Not dramatically. It was functional, profitable at a basic level. But there were inefficiencies I recognized immediately. Some of them the same ones I had flagged internally 6 years ago and watched go unaddressed. Processes that had calcified. Habits that had become invisible because nobody had looked at them freshly in years. I addressed them the same way I addressed everything else. Directly, professionally, without referencing the history. In our working meetings, Richard was cooperative. That's the right word. Not warm. We were never going to be warm. But professional and cooperative. He engaged with my assessment seriously. He implemented the changes I recommended without resistance. He contributed to the meetings in a way that was genuinely useful. I respected that. It would have been easy for him to be difficult, to drag his feet, to find subtle ways to complicate the relationship. He didn't. Whatever he felt privately about the situation, he kept it out of the work. I noticed that and credited him for it. The months moved steadily. I settled into the rhythm of the role. The early mornings that were now genuinely mine. The decisions that carried real weight and real consequences. The satisfaction of watching the portfolio companies improve in ways that were measurable and clear. Thomas told me in one of our regular check-ins that the firm was pleased, that the early results were tracking ahead of their projections, that the approach I had brought to the portfolio was exactly what they had hoped for when they made the acquisition. I thanked him, went back to work. There were moments, quiet ones, usually at the end of a long day, where I thought about the arc of the last 2 years. The box, the elevator, the kitchen table, the notebook with the list of everything I actually had. I thought about the version of myself that had sat in that all-hands meeting and heard his name announced in front of everyone. The stillness I had maintained. The box I had packed quietly. The decision not to say a single word to Richard on the way out. I had not known then where any of it was going. I had just known how I wanted to carry myself through it. And I had carried myself that way. Every step, every decision, every moment where the easier thing would have been to react, and I had chosen instead to move. The boardroom moment. The Wednesday morning, Richard walking through the door, the half-second of recognition on his face. I had thought it might feel like something large when it arrived. It hadn't. It had felt like a Wednesday morning, like a meeting starting on time, like work that needed doing in a room full of people ready to do it. That was the thing I hadn't anticipated. Not that the moment would feel small, but that it would feel exactly the right size. Proportionate. Earned. The natural conclusion of 2 years of building something real rather than spending those 2 years waiting for a moment. I hadn't been waiting for Richard. I had been building for myself. And there was one more thing still to come, something I hadn't anticipated, something that arrived quietly a few months later, that would close the full circle of everything that had started on that Tuesday morning in March. It was Thomas who told me. We were in one of our regular check-ins, coffee, 40 minutes, the standing review of how things were tracking across the portfolio. He went through the numbers. I took my notes. Standard meeting. Then at the end he mentioned, almost as a footnote, that Richard's company had formally requested a strategic review. That Richard had submitted a proposal through the firm's internal process recommending a restructure of his own leadership team. Thomas slid the document across the table. I read the first page. Richard was recommending the elevation of 2 senior members of his team into roles that would carry more operational authority. He was restructuring his own position, pulling back from day-to-day operations and moving into a more advisory capacity. He was, in careful corporate language, stepping aside. Not forced out, not publicly removed, not handed a box in front of everyone who worked for him. Just stepping back, quietly, on his own terms, with enough dignity intact to make it look like a choice. I sat with that for a moment. Thomas asked what I thought of the proposal. I read through the rest of it carefully. The 2 people Richard was recommending were solid. I had met them both in portfolio meetings over the preceding months. They were competent and direct, and they engaged with feedback without ego. They would be easier to work with, not because Richard had been obstructive, but because they didn't carry the weight of complicated history into every room they walked into. I told Thomas the proposal made sense, that I would support it. He nodded, said he thought so too. The restructure was approved the following week. I didn't hear from Richard directly about it. There was no final conversation, no formal goodbye, no moment where we stood in a corridor and acknowledged the full strange arc of what had happened between us across two companies and two very different tables. He filed his proposal. It was approved. The transition happened through the normal channels, which was exactly as it should have been. There was nothing left that needed to be said between us. Everything that needed to be communicated had been communicated, some of it in words, most of it simply in the reality of a Wednesday morning meeting and where each of us had been sitting. I closed the proposal document, handed it back to Thomas. We moved on to the next item. The new leadership team at Richard's company was good. Things moved more cleanly almost immediately. The operational improvements I had been working through for months began to accelerate without the layer of complicated history underneath every interaction. Decisions that had been slow started moving quickly. The team responded to direct feedback with genuine energy rather than the careful, hedged engagement I had grown used to. Results improved visibly inside 2 quarters. I noted it, filed it, moved on. That was the rhythm of the work now. And I want to spend a moment on the work because it was the part that mattered most to me. Not the title, not the floor, not the firm's name on my correspondence, though those things were real and I won't pretend otherwise. What I actually valued was something simpler and harder to articulate. For 6 years inside Richard's company, I had operated inside a structure where the line between what I did and what I was credited for was never clean. The work was good. The results were real. But they passed through layers before they became visible, through management, through presentation, through the political geography of who was in which room when which conversation happened. By the time the value landed somewhere, it had usually been reassigned. I had accepted that as the nature of organizational life. What I hadn't understood until I built something myself was how much of my energy had been quietly spent navigating that gap. The low-level maintenance of working inside a structure that didn't fully see you. The constant small adjustments of someone who has learned not to expect the clean version of things. I didn't have to do that anymore. The connection between my decisions and the outcomes was direct now. Visible, honest. When something worked, it was clear why it had worked. When something didn't, I could see exactly where the thinking had failed and correct it without anyone else's fingerprints on the problem. That clarity was worth more to me than anything the title conferred. My team at the firm grew steadily through that period. I hired carefully, which meant slowly, which some people found frustrating. But I had a clear picture of what I was looking for, and I wasn't willing to compromise it for the sake of moving quickly. I hired people who were good at the work and honest about what they didn't know. People who didn't need an audience to perform for. People who could sit in a room where nobody was watching and still do the thing properly. I recognized them easily because I'd spent years being one. I managed them the way I had always wanted to be managed. High expectations stated clearly from the beginning. Genuine trust once those expectations were met. Credit given directly and specifically, not in vague, collective language that dissolved into the atmosphere, but named. Your work, your thinking, your result. Several of them told me at different points that it was different from anywhere they had worked before. I told them it should be the standard, that it wasn't a gift, it was just accuracy. The work compounded. That's the word I kept coming back to during that period. Not grew exactly, compounded. Each thing built on the last. Each client relationship deepened. Each portfolio improvement created a reference point for the next conversation. The reputation of the work moved through the industry steadily and without any particular effort on my part to push it. I had learned a long time ago that you cannot manufacture that kind of reputation. You can only build the work and let it move at its own pace. 18 months into the role, Thomas raised the question of a formal partnership. We had the conversation over 2 meetings. Unhurried, direct in the way our conversations always were. The terms were fair. The structure reflected what I had actually contributed. There was no performance of generosity on either side. Just 2 people who respected each other's work agreeing on what was accurate. I accepted. There was no ceremony. No announcement to a room full of people. No moment designed to be witnessed. Just a handshake. A document. 2 professionals agreeing that something worth continuing had been built. I drove home that evening on roads I had driven 100 times. I thought about a Tuesday morning in March more than 2 years earlier. The unscheduled meeting. My name called out in front of full room. The specific quality of the silence that followed. The silence of a room full of people who didn't know where to look. I thought about the HR woman and her apologetic face and the box already in her hands. I thought about packing my desk, the small plant in the corner, the colleagues who stood nearby without knowing what to say. I thought about the elevator, the ride down, the lobby, walking out into the street with a box under my arm and no particular place to be. And I thought about what I had done with that. Not immediately. Not the dramatic version where someone walks out of humiliation and straight into a plan. The real version. The kitchen table. The quiet week. The notebook. The slow, unglamorous process of building something from nothing with no guarantee that it would become anything at all. I had not known on that Tuesday morning where any of it was going. I had only known how I wanted to carry myself through it. That turned out to be enough. Not because carrying yourself well is magic. Not because dignity automatically converts into success. But because the way you move through hard things shapes what you are capable of building on the other side of them. The decision not to make a scene in that room. The decision not to waste the months that followed on anger. The decision to put everything into the work rather than into the grievance. Each of those decisions had compounded too. Into a Wednesday morning on the 22nd floor. Into a seat at the head of a table I had earned completely. Into a life that was without drama, without fanfare, without ever needing anyone to acknowledge what had happened. Better in every measurable way than the one that had been taken from me. I don't think about Richard much anymore. When I do, it is without heat. He made a decision that he thought served him, and it set something in motion that ultimately served me far better than staying would have. I can't be angry about that. The math doesn't support it. What I think about more, what stays with me when I think back on all of it, is something smaller than the boardroom moment. Something quieter. It's the elevator, the ride down, the decision made somewhere between the 14th floor and the lobby to keep my mouth shut and my head up and walk out into whatever came next. That was the moment that mattered. Everything else followed from it. The most dangerous thing you can do after someone underestimates you is prove them right by how you respond. Walk out clean. Build something real. Let the work find its own way back to the room. It always does. If this one stayed with you, leave a comment below. I read every one of them. And if you want to hear another story, the next one is already waiting. I'll see you there.